kids trying to sleep. It was one party, all right? We were done by midnight.
You're exaggerating.
Midnight?
My windows were shaking.
I've got recordings. It's ridiculous.
You need to calm
Don't tell me to calm.
October 15th, 2023, Charleston, South Carolina. Margaret Thornfield opened her front door expecting a delivery. Instead, she found Marcus Washington holding a manila envelope that would destroy her life in the next 12 minutes. He was young, black, wearing a federal prosecutor's badge, and he had the DNA results that proved everything she believed for 15 years was a lie. "Mrs. Thornfield," Marcus said, his voice steady as granite. "We need to talk about the Coleman Hayes case." Margaret's blood turned to ice. Coleman Hayes, the man she'd helped send to death row for killing her daughter. The man executed 3 years ago while she watched through the glass. The man who was innocent. Marcus stepped forward. Margaret stepped back. But there was nowhere to run from what came next. Because Marcus Washington wasn't just any federal attorney. He was Coleman Hayes' son. And he hadn't come for justice. He'd come to collect a debt 15 years in the making. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 o'clock as Margaret's hand tightened on the brass doorknob. The sound echoed through the mansion's marble foyer like a death knell, each note driving home the impossible reality standing on her doorstep. Coleman Hayes' son. The resemblance was there now that she knew. The same deep-set eyes, the same strong jawline that had stared back at her from the defendant's table all those years ago. But where Coleman's face had been weathered by poverty and desperation, Marcus Washington carried himself with the polished confidence of federal authority. His tailored suit cost more than Coleman had probably made in a year. "You're mistaken," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Coleman Hayes murdered my daughter. The jury convicted him. The evidence was manufactured." Marcus's words cut through her denial like a blade. He held up the manila envelope, its contents promising to demolish everything she'd built her survival upon. DNA analysis using technology that didn't exist in 2008. "Your daughter's real killer left genetic material under her fingernails that never matched Coleman Hayes." The words hit her like physical blows. Margaret felt her knees buckle slightly, one manicured hand reaching for the doorframe to steady herself. Behind Marcus, Charleston's historic district stretched out in afternoon shadows, the same cobblestone streets where she'd walked as a child, where her family had lived for generations, where she'd once believed in justice and order and the fundamental rightness of the world. "That's impossible," she breathed. "The trial, I was there every day. I saw the evidence. Blood evidence, fingerprints. Circumstantial. Planted. Convenient." Marcus stepped closer, and Margaret caught a whiff of expensive cologne mixed with something else, the scent of barely controlled rage. "My father was a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time, with a public defender who spent exactly 47 minutes preparing his case. You were the grieving mother of a murdered white girl. The math was simple." Margaret's mind reeled. 15 years of carefully constructed certainty began to crack like ice in spring. She remembered the trial, her testimony, her tears, her absolute conviction that justice was being served. She remembered the satisfaction when the verdict came down, the sense that Sarah's death finally meant something, that order had been restored to chaos. "Your father confessed," she said desperately. "He confessed to killing Sarah." After 18 hours of interrogation without a lawyer present, after they told him they had DNA evidence that didn't exist, after they promised him life instead of death if he just admitted what everyone already knew he'd done. Marcus's voice remained steady, professional, but Margaret could see the fire burning behind his eyes. He recanted the next day, but by then the confession was all anyone heard. The mansion suddenly felt too small, its antebellum grandeur pressing down on her like a weight. These walls had sheltered her family for 6 generations, had seen them through wars and reconstruction, and the slow evolution of a South that pretended it had changed. Now they felt like a mausoleum, preserving something rotten and dead. "Why are you here?" Margaret asked, though she already feared the answer. "If this is about overturning the conviction, Coleman is... he's already... dead." Yes, the word fell between them like a gravestone, executed by lethal injection on March 15th, 2020, while you sat in the witness gallery. "I was there too, Mrs. Thornfield. In the back row, watching them murder my innocent father while his victim's mother nodded in approval." Margaret remembered that day, the final chapter in Sarah's story, the moment she thought she could finally move forward. She'd felt something like peace as Coleman Hayes took his last breath, believing justice had been served at last. Now that memory curdled in her stomach like poison. "What do you want?" she whispered. Marcus smiled then, and it was the most terrifying expression Margaret had ever seen. Not angry, not bitter, but coldly satisfied. The smile of a man who had waited years for this moment and planned every word, every gesture, every devastating revelation. "I want what you took from me, Mrs. Thornfield. I want your certainty, your peace of mind, your comfortable ignorance about who you really are and what you've really done." He tapped the envelope against his palm. "But first, I want you to know the truth about who really killed your daughter. Because when you hear that name, someone you trusted, someone you protected, someone who let an innocent man die for their crime, you going to understand that your grief made you complicit in murder." The autumn wind picked up, scattering leaves across the mansion's front steps like blood drops. Margaret stood frozen in her doorway, caught between the life she thought she knew and the abyss Marcus Washington had opened at her feet. "Are you going to invite me in?" Marcus asked. "Or shall we discuss your daughter's real killer out here where the neighbors can hear?" Margaret's eyes darted beyond Marcus to the neighboring mansions, their windows like watching eyes behind ancient live oaks draped in Spanish moss. Mrs. Beaumont from next door had a habit of watering her prize-winning azaleas at precisely this time, and the Cromwell twins across Rainbow Row were notorious gossips who collected Charleston secrets like their mother collected Waterford crystal. "Come in," she whispered, stepping aside. The marble foyer swallowed them both, its black and white checkered pattern stretching toward a mahogany staircase that curved upward like a question mark. Marcus's footsteps echoed against the high ceilings, each sound sharp and intrusive in a space designed for whispered conversations and carefully modulated southern voices. Margaret closed the door, the heavy oak sealing them inside with her grandfather's ghost and her own mounting dread. "Impressive," Marcus said, his gaze traveling over oil portraits of long-dead Thornfields, their painted eyes seeming to follow his movement. "6 generations of Charleston aristocracy. Your grandfather was Judge Thornfield, wasn't he? The one who sentenced 43 black men to death between 1955 and 1978? Margaret's hands trembled as she smoothed her silk blouse. "That was a different time." "Yes, it was." Marcus moved deeper into the foyer, studying a particular portrait, her great-great-grandfather in Confederate gray. Amazing how times change, but patterns remain the same. The grandfather clock ticked steadily, marking seconds that felt like hours. Margaret had inherited this house 15 years ago, after Sarah's death, when she could no longer bear their family home with its empty bedroom and lingering memories. She thought this place would heal her, surrounded by history, by the weight of generations who had survived their own tragedies. Instead, she'd simply learned to live with the hollow ache where her heart used to be. "Would you like coffee?" The words came automatically, Southern hospitality bred into her bones despite the circumstances. In this house, even enemies were offered refreshment. "No, thank you." Marcus turned to face her, and in the foyer's muted light, she could see more of Coleman Hayes in his features, the stubborn set of his jaw, the way his left eyebrow lifted slightly when he was thinking. It made her stomach clench with something that might have been recognition or guilt or terror. Through the archway leading to the morning room, afternoon sunlight streamed across the Persian rug where she took her tea each day at 4 o'clock. The ritual had sustained her through 15 years of careful forgetting, Earl Grey with honey, yesterday's mail sorted into neat piles, the Charleston Post and Courier's crossword puzzle completed in blue ink. Order imposed on chaos, routine as armor against remembering. "This is where you've been hiding," Marcus observed, following her gaze. "Playing the grieving mother, the victim of senseless violence. Lunch at the Charleston Country Club, charity galas for the Historical Society. A quiet life built on a lie." Margaret's throat tightened. The life he described wasn't hiding, it was surviving. After Sarah's death, those routines, those familiar faces, that predictable rhythm of days had been the only thing standing between her and complete collapse. She'd lost her husband to cancer 5 years before losing Sarah to violence. This house, these traditions, this carefully maintained existence were all that remained. "I have a granddaughter," she said suddenly, the words escaping before she could stop them. "Emma, she's 8. Marcus's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Sarah's daughter? She lives with her father in Atlanta. Visits every summer. Margaret's voice grew stronger, protective instincts overriding fear. She doesn't know. She was too young when it happened. She thinks her mother died in a car accident. The manila envelope crinkled as Marcus shifted it from hand to hand. What does she call you? Grammy. The word came out soft, aching. She calls me Grammy, and she loves the garden behind the house, the camellias. Every July, we pick them together for her bedroom. Margaret could see Emma now in her mind. Gap-toothed smile, Sarah's blue eyes, that fearless way she climbed the old magnolia tree despite Margaret's anxious warnings. Emma was the one bright thread connecting Margaret to life. The single reason she still bothered getting dressed each morning, still maintained this facade of genteel survival. She doesn't need to know about any of this, Margaret continued, her voice hardening with desperation. Whatever you think you found, whatever mistakes you believe were made, it doesn't change anything now. Sarah is still dead. Your father is still... She couldn't finish the sentence. Dead. Yes. Marcus stepped closer, his shadow falling across the marble between them. But my father died innocent, Mrs. Thornfield. And somewhere out there, your daughter's real killer has been living free for 15 years, probably sleeping peacefully every night while you built shrines to your pain and I buried my father's ashes. The house seemed to hold its breath around them, thick with the weight of old secrets and older sins. Outside, Charleston continued its eternal dance of beauty and decay, Spanish moss swaying in the autumn breeze like widow's veils. Marcus lifted the envelope. Shall we begin? Margaret stared at the envelope as if it contained a bomb. In her peripheral vision, dust motes danced in the afternoon light, streaming through the fanlight above the door. The same light that had illuminated this foyer when her grandfather held court here, when her father brought his legal colleagues home for bourbon and cigars, when she descended these stairs in her wedding dress 29 years ago. I don't want to see it, she whispered. Marcus's laugh held no humor. Neither did I. Do you think I wanted to spend 3 years of my life proving my father died for another man's crime? Do you think I enjoyed reading autopsy reports, crime scene photographs, witness statements that were never properly investigated? He opened the envelope's metal clasp with deliberate precision. But here we are. The first document he withdrew was a laboratory report, its official letterhead crisp and clinical. Margaret recognized the Federal Bureau's insignia even as her mind recoiled from its implications. The pages rustled like autumn leaves as Marcus spread them across the antique console table beneath her great-grandfather's portrait. DNA extracted from Sarah's fingernails, Marcus said, his voice taking on the measured cadence of a courtroom presentation. Analyzed using advanced techniques that weren't available in 2008. The genetic profile shows definitively that my father never touched your daughter. Margaret's hands flew to her throat, fingering the pearl necklace that had belonged to her mother. That's impossible. The evidence at trial... There was no DNA evidence at trial. Marcus's words cut through her protest like a scalpel. The prosecutor claimed it was too degraded to analyze. What he didn't mention was that he never sent it to the lab in the first place. The grandfather clock's pendulum swung hypnotically as Margaret tried to process this revelation. She remembered District Attorney Harrison Wells's closing argument, his passionate description of a violent struggle, Sarah fighting for her life against her attacker. He'd painted such a vivid picture that Margaret could almost see it happening, almost feel her daughter's terror as if it were her own. Harrison Wells withheld evidence? Her voice sounded strange, distant, as if someone else were speaking. Harrison Wells built a career on convenient convictions. Marcus pulled out a second document, a thick file bound with red tape. 47 cases over 12 years, an 89% conviction rate that got him elected as Charleston's youngest district attorney. My father was just another black man who happened to fit his narrative. Margaret's legs gave way. She sank onto the velvet-upholstered bench that had sat in this spot for 3 generations, her carefully maintained composure cracking like old porcelain. The house suddenly felt foreign around her, as if the walls themselves were listening to Marcus's revelations with the same horrified fascination she couldn't suppress. Sarah was found in Waterfront Park, she said desperately, grasping for solid ground. Your father worked construction nearby. He had a criminal record. Shoplifting, trespassing, misdemeanor drug possession. Marcus's fingers drummed against the manila envelope. Survival crimes, Mrs. Thornfield. The crimes of a man trying to feed his family after Charleston's shipyard closed and took every decent job with it. Through the archway to the morning room, Margaret could see the silver-framed photograph of Sarah she kept on the side table, her daughter at 25, radiant in her medical school graduation gown. Sarah had been going to be a pediatrician. She'd spent her final summer volunteering at the free clinic downtown, treating children whose parents couldn't afford proper health care. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret now. Then who? The question escaped as barely a whisper. If not Coleman, then who killed my daughter? Marcus smiled, and the expression chilled Margaret to her bones. It was the smile of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey, who had waited years for this perfect moment of revelation. He reached into the envelope one final time and withdrew a photograph. Not a crime scene photo, but something older. A snapshot from what looked like a social gathering. Margaret's heart stopped. The photograph showed Sarah at what appeared to be a charity function, her arm around a man Margaret knew well, someone she'd seen at the funeral offering condolences with tears in his eyes, someone who'd called regularly in the months after the murder, checking on her welfare, bringing flowers from his garden, someone who'd stood beside her at Coleman Hayes' execution, offering silent support as justice was finally served. Dr. Richard Pemberton, Marcus said softly, watching Margaret's face drain of color. Your family physician, your friend, the man who signed Sarah's death certificate and testified at my father's trial about the nature of her injuries. The photograph fluttered from Margaret's nerveless fingers to the marble floor, landing face up between them like an accusation. In the image, Sarah was laughing at something Pemberton had whispered in her ear, her head tilted back in genuine joy. Margaret remembered that night now, a medical society fundraiser where Sarah had been honored for her volunteer work. Outside, Charleston church bells began their 4 o'clock symphony, their bronze voices carrying across the historic district as they had for centuries. But inside the Thornfield mansion, time had stopped entirely, suspended in the moment when Margaret's world finally, irrevocably shattered. The church bells continued their ancient song, but Margaret heard only the thundering of her own pulse in her ears. The photograph lay between them like a piece of evidence at a crime scene, which, she realized with mounting horror, was exactly what it had become. No. The word escaped her lips as a whisper, then grew stronger, more desperate. No, Richard couldn't. He was Sarah's godfather. He delivered her when she was born. He's been my physician for 20 years. Marcus watched her with the clinical detachment of a surgeon making an incision. When did Dr. Pemberton first suggest that you needed something to help you sleep? Something to calm your nerves after the trauma? Margaret's hand instinctively moved to her purse, where the amber prescription bottle rested like a faithful companion. Lorazepam, prescribed by Richard the week after Sarah's funeral. That was medical care. I was grieving. When did the regular house calls start? The concerned friend checking on the widow? The question struck her like physical blows. Richard's face swam in her memory, his gentle concern, his patient listening as she relived Sarah's final days over and over, his steady presence during the trial. He'd been the one to drive her to the execution, holding her arm as she walked into the witness gallery to watch Coleman Hayes die. He was helping me, Margaret said, but the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. The grandfather clock's ticking seemed to grow louder, marking seconds that stretched like hours. Marcus knelt and retrieved the photograph, studying it with the same intensity Margaret had once reserved for evidence photos during the trial. Your daughter was beautiful, intelligent, compassionate. His voice softened for the first time since he'd arrived. She didn't deserve what happened to her. Margaret felt tears threatening for the first time in years. She'd trained herself not to cry, not to break down, not to let the grief consume her the way it had in those first terrible months. Why are you showing me this? If you believe... She couldn't finish the thought. Because Dr. Pemberton is still practicing medicine, Mrs. Thornfield, still making house calls to vulnerable women, still prescribing medication to patients who trust him. Marcus placed the photograph carefully back in the envelope. Still walking free while my father rots in Charleston's Magnolia Cemetery. The morning room suddenly felt miles away instead of steps. Margaret's daily routine, her 4 o'clock tea, her careful rituals of survival, seemed to belong to another woman, someone naive enough to believe in justice and order and the fundamental goodness of people she'd known all her life. Her phone buzzed on the console table. Richard's name appeared on the screen, as if summoned by their conversation. Margaret stared at it, remembering countless similar calls over the past 15 years, checking on her health, reminding her about appointments, suggesting adjustments to her medication when the grief seemed too heavy to bear. "Answer it," Marcus said quietly. Margaret's hand shook as she reached for the phone. "I can't. I don't know what to say." "Tell him you're fine. Tell him you're looking forward to seeing him at the Morrison wedding this weekend." Marcus's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Tell him everything is normal." The phone continued buzzing, Richard's familiar number persistent in its demand for attention. Margaret thought of Emma, her granddaughter who would visit next summer, who still climbed the magnolia tree with fearless joy. What would happen to that innocent world if this nightmare proved true? "He'll know something's wrong," Margaret whispered. "Richard has known me too long. He'll hear it in my voice." "Then you'd better be convincing." Marcus moved to the front window, peering through the lace curtains toward the street. "Because if Dr. Pemberton suspects that his carefully constructed lie is unraveling, if he realizes that someone is finally asking the right questions about Sarah's death, what do you think he'll do to protect himself?" The phone's buzzing stopped, leaving only the clock's relentless ticking and the distant sound of Charleston traffic. Margaret stared at the missed call notification, imagining Richard in his office at the medical center, perhaps wondering why she hadn't answered, perhaps already sensing that something had shifted in the careful equilibrium he'd maintained for 15 years. "I need to call him back," she said, the words coming from some automatic place of social conditioning. "He'll worry if I don't." Marcus turned from the window, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Thornfield, do you understand what I'm telling you? The man who killed your daughter has been your friend, your confidant, your physician for 15 years. He's watched you grieve, prescribed medication for your pain, comforted you through the trial and execution of an innocent man. And tomorrow, if you let him, he'll do it again." Outside, the autumn light was fading, casting long shadows across the foyer's marble floor. Margaret sat frozen on the velvet bench, caught between the life she thought she knew and the abyss Marcus had opened at her feet, while Richard Pemberton's name glowed on her phone screen like an accusation waiting to be answered. Margaret's finger hovered over the callback button, trembling like a leaf in winter wind. The phone felt impossibly heavy in her palm. This device that had been her lifeline to the outside world for so many years, through which Richard's reassuring voice had guided her through countless sleepless nights and panic attacks. "What if you're wrong?" she whispered, though the words felt like prayers to a God who'd already abandoned her. "What if this is all some terrible mistake?" Marcus's reflection in the foyer mirror was sharp as broken glass. "Then call him. Have a normal conversation. Ask about his grandchildren, his golf game, his patience." His voice carried a predator's patience. "But listen, Mrs. Thornfield, really listen. To the pauses, to what he doesn't say." The house creaked around them, settling into evening shadows that transformed familiar corners into threatening alcoves. Margaret pressed the callback button before she could lose her nerve. Richard answered on the first ring. "Maggie, darling, I was worried when you didn't answer." The endearment hit her like a physical blow. Maggie. Only 3 people in her entire life had called her that: her father, her late husband, and Richard. It had always felt intimate, familial, safe. Now it sounded like fingers around her throat. "I was in the garden," she managed. "The camellias need pruning before winter." "Of course they do. You in that garden." Richard's chuckle was warm, practiced, exactly the same as it had been yesterday morning when he'd called to remind her about her annual physical next month. "I hope you're not overdoing it. Remember what I said about your blood pressure." Margaret's eyes found Marcus, who stood motionless by the window like a statue carved from judgment itself. He nodded slightly, encouraging her to continue the charade. "Richard, do you remember Sarah's last year in medical school? That charity fundraiser where she received the Volunteer Service Award?" The silence lasted exactly 3 heartbeats too long. Margaret had prosecuted enough criminals to recognize the moment when a lie was being constructed, polished, prepared for delivery. The medical society dinner, yes. She looked beautiful that night, so proud in her speech about serving underprivileged communities. Richard's voice carried perfect notes of fondness and grief. "Why do you ask, darling?" "Because I found a photograph," Margaret thought. "Because a man whose father we murdered together just showed me proof that you've been lying to me for 15 years. Because I can suddenly hear the calculation in your voice, the careful modulation that sounds like love but tastes like poison." I was going through some old photos. Sometimes the memories just surface. Of course they do. Grief isn't linear, Maggie. We've talked about this. Richard's professional demeanor slipped into place like a well-worn mask. Are you taking your medication regularly? Sometimes when patients skip doses, they experience increased anxiety, intrusive thoughts. The pills. Always the pills. Margaret's gaze fell to her purse, where the amber bottle waited with its promise of chemical peace. How many times had Richard adjusted her dosage? Increased the strength when she seemed too alert, too questioning? Decreased it when she appeared too foggy, too disconnected from the world around her? Actually, I've been feeling clearer lately. More aware. The words came out stronger than she'd intended. Another pause. Shorter this time, but sharp as a scalpel. That's wonderful to hear. But clarity can sometimes be overwhelming after trauma. Perhaps we should schedule an appointment this week instead of waiting until next month? Marcus stepped away from the window, moving closer to Margaret with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to hunting. In the dying light, his resemblance to Coleman Hayes was undeniable. The same broad shoulders, the same careful way of moving through spaces that had never been designed to welcome him. The Morrison wedding is this Saturday, Margaret said, testing. You're still planning to attend? Wouldn't miss it. Eleanor Morrison specifically requested that I escort you, actually. She's concerned about you attending social functions alone. Richard's voice brightened with what sounded like genuine affection. I told her you're stronger than she gives you credit for, but you know how the church ladies worry. Eleanor Morrison had been Sarah's piano teacher 20 years ago. She'd sobbed at the funeral, held Margaret's hand during the trial, sent casseroles for months afterward. The idea that she'd been discussing Margaret's mental state with Richard felt like another small betrayal, another thread in a web she was only beginning to see. That's very kind of both of you, Margaret said carefully. I'll pick you up at 6:30. We can stop for dinner first. You've been losing weight again. Richard's concern sounded so genuine that Margaret almost forgot the photograph lying in Marcus's envelope, almost forgot the DNA evidence that proved Coleman Hayes had died for another man's crime. The call ended with promises of care, with gentle reminders about medication schedules and social obligations. Margaret set the phone down with hands that shook like autumn branches in a storm. He knows, she whispered. Marcus smiled, and the expression contained 15 years of patient fury. Yes, and now he knows that you know. The weight of Marcus's words settled over Margaret like a burial shroud. She stared at her phone, where Richard's number still glowed on the recent calls list, remembering now with crystalline clarity how quickly he'd offered to escort her to the Morrison wedding, how concerned he'd sounded about her mental state, how eager he was to schedule an earlier appointment. He's going to increase my medication, she said, the realization hitting her like ice water. Tomorrow, when I see him, he'll say I'm having a breakdown. That grief has finally gotten the better of me. Marcus nodded slowly. How long have you been on benzodiazepines, Mrs. Thornfield? 15 years. Since right after, Margaret's voice caught. The amber bottle in her purse suddenly felt like evidence, like proof of her own willing participation in her mental imprisonment. He said it would help with the panic attacks. And the panic attacks started when? Margaret closed her eyes, forcing herself to remember those first horrible weeks after Sarah's death. The sleepless nights, the racing heart, the overwhelming sense that the world had become a dangerous place where daughters could be murdered in public parks. After Sarah died. But they got worse during the investigation. When the police kept asking questions I couldn't answer. What kind of questions? The grandfather clock chimed 5 times, each note reverberating through the mansion like a countdown. Margaret found herself walking toward the morning room without conscious thought, drawn to Sarah's photograph like a moth to flame. In the silver frame, her daughter's smile was radiant, unburdened by knowledge of what was coming. About Sarah's relationships, her social life, whether she was seeing anyone. Margaret's voice grew smaller with each word. I told them she was focused on her studies, that she didn't have time for romance. But there were things, calls that ended when I entered the room, meetings that ran late, a new dress I'd never seen before. Marcus followed her into the morning room, his presence transforming the familiar space into something foreign and dangerous. You suspected she was involved with someone. I thought maybe another medical student, someone inappropriate, married perhaps, or much older. Sarah was always drawn to complicated situations, people who needed saving. Margaret touched the silver frame with trembling fingers. I convinced myself it didn't matter. that her private life was her own business. But you mentioned it to Dr. Pemberton. The memory hit her with devastating clarity. Richard sitting in this very room 3 days after the funeral, holding her hands while she sobbed out her regrets and fears. She told him everything, her suspicions about Sarah's secret relationship, her guilt over not pressing for details, her desperate need to understand why her daughter had been in Waterfront Park that night instead of home studying. He listened, Margaret whispered. He was so patient, so understanding. He said Sarah's love life wasn't relevant to what happened, that dwelling on it would only increase my guilt and trauma, and that's when he first prescribed a lorazepam. Yes. The word came out like a confession. He said I needed to focus on healing, not on unanswerable questions about what Sarah might have been hiding. Marcus moved to the window overlooking the garden where Margaret's prized camellias caught the last rays of autumn sunlight. Mrs. Thornfield, what if Sarah wasn't hiding a relationship? What if she was hiding from one? The air in the room grew thin, suffocating. Margaret sank into her reading chair, the same chair where she'd spent countless evenings over the past 15 years, medicated and compliant, reading novels that helped her forget the unanswered questions about her daughter's death. You're saying Richard was... She couldn't finish the sentence. I'm saying your daughter was 25 years old, beautiful, and compassionate. She was also the daughter of Charleston's most prominent federal prosecutor, which made her both a prize and a target. Marcus turned from the window, his expression carved from stone. I'm saying Dr. Pemberton had access to your home, your family, your trust. And when Sarah tried to end things, when she threatened to tell you what he'd been doing, Margaret's carefully maintained composure finally shattered. The sob that escaped her throat sounded like something dying, a sound of grief so profound it seemed to shake the very foundations of the antebellum mansion. For 15 years she'd believed justice had been served. For 15 years she'd mourned her daughter while taking comfort from the man who'd killed her. He watched Coleman Hayes die. She gasped through her tears. Richard was there with me at the execution. He held my hand when they... Her voice broke completely. Yes, Marcus said simply. And I was there too. In the witness gallery, 17 years old, watching them murder my father while his killer comforted the grieving mother. The grandfather clock's pendulum swung hypnotically, marking time that could never be recovered, measuring the space between Margaret's old life and the abyss that had opened before her. Outside, Charleston settled into evening with its usual genteel grace, unaware that inside the Thornfield mansion, the carefully constructed lies of 15 years were finally crumbling into dust.